Now, let's begin to plan out our environment. For that, I like to use what I refer to as the Disneyland approach. Now, I have no idea if this is actually what most people call it, but it's generally what I go with, as it's based off Disneyland itself. If you're not familiar with Disneyland, Disneyland is broken into many different subzones throughout the entire park. Each area is based on a specific look or given theme, such as Tomorrowland being based off space, Adventureland being based off kind of like the wilderness, the jungle. We have Frontierland, which is a very deserty theme. And in the middle, you have Fantasyland, which is the castle, the very iconic Disneyland look that everyone sees. Each zone has its own unique feel and flavor, its own theming that helps it separate itself from all the other areas of the park, or environment in our case. Now, while it does separate itself, it's still connected as a whole. And so we want to make sure that we make our entire environment feel like it's all connected while still having each section have a unique aspect to it. This can be points of interest, color, some different types of shape language. These are all great ways to break up different sections of your large scale environment to make them feel like a larger world. Much like Disneyland, we want to have a central key element that really connects the entire environment together. In the case of Disneyland, this is smack dab in the middle and is the castle. In the Western Ghats, we had a large tower that stood up and rose from the very middle of the map. You could then just break off and travel anywhere you wanted to any other section fairly easy. You would always have a central location that was essentially your northern star. You always knew if you went to that one point, you'd be able to get to any place on the map you wanted. Now, this key center point doesn't actually have to be in the center. It just has to be very large, iconic, and ideally it can be seen from all sections of your environment, or in the case of Disneyland, from anywhere in the park. You can pretty much see the Magic Kingdom's castle. So that's what we want to look for when we're choosing our really iconic focal point of our scene. Now, this should be your main focal point of the scene that you're building, along with one additional focal point in the scene to help draw players along. It doesn't have to be a completely new zone like we have here, but this is if you want to think about planning a larger environment. Again, for this class, it's only 10 weeks long, so you're not going to be able to make all of Disneyland. I wasn't able to make all of the Western Ghats hub level in 10 weeks, so please don't try and do that. You'll cut yourself very thin. Now, a point to remember is that the main focal point area of our scene is connected to each subsection, but each subsection generally you want to have connected to another subsection. Tomorrowland here is connected to Main Street and also up here in the back end of the Matterhorn Mountain. We want to be able to connect our environment together so it all feels like they are an entire environment. If we just have them connect to the central area, then you got a very linear structured level. We want to be able to have them flow together, going back and forth, connecting in and out. And so in essence, that is the Disneyland approach, creating different zones that all have their own unique feel and flavor to them. A key focal section that all roads essentially lead back to is the great hub of the entire environment. You always know where to go. And sections should all lead to not only that focal area, but they should connect to their adjoining sections so that they have this cohesive feel and feel like they belong together instead of just alone. Now, take for example, Uncharted 4's Madagascar area. This was our largest environment, and to make this environment, I broke it down very much using the same Disneyland principle of creating different zones and subzones, each having their own unique feel and flavor to them. So as we can see here, you start off essentially in the desert plains. It's very dusty, deserty, has very orange colors, light foliage, and even the foliage that is here is very dead and dried out. We connect it here with the oasis, which is lush green. It's this really nice pocket of life in the middle of this really dusty desert. Connected to that, we have these eroded earth slopes. They're kind of where the terrain has just like started to break away. It's falling away. It's turning into sand, which eventually becomes the desert plain. Not only are these two sections connected visually, but also in a logistic sense. Earth tends to break away and just become either dirt or sand. And so that's how you get these desert plains. On the other side over here, we have the sandy cliffs. They were a much more large granite cliff faces that had all their terrain, all their grass and foliage pretty much stripped out, and it was very much just the sand was kind of left on it. The idea being that the wind has really battered these areas, and all that's really left is sand and soot and dirt, and the plants just don't really have much to grab onto due to the wind. That was mainly because over here you can see that we have the ocean and the wind just keeps blowing in. It's one thing to keep in mind, you know, where the breeze is coming from, you're going to have a lot harsher wind, and that can just really destroy a lot of foliage along the cliffside. In the middle, we had the rolling hills. These were basically protected by these huge cliffs we had all around the entire environment. So they're a great place for a lot of life and vegetation to grow. A lot of water will collect when it falls down these vertical cliffs and create a lot of grass and a lot of trees. It allowed us to have these really nice, just smooth rolling hills of grass, which turned out to look really great. On the other side, the complete opposite of the sandy cliffs, we had the grassy cliffs. You know, you got to change it up every now and then. So these cliffs were a little more protected from the ocean air, and they had a bit more foliage growing on them. Not overly abundant foliage, as it is still Madagascar, and it is a harsher desert environment, but it still had enough foliage that it gave it a different look. And there were larger tiered cliffs that you could like drive around here, you could drive up here, and then eventually you could drive all the way up here. So it gave a different look and a different gameplay feel to it. Up top here, we had the vertical cliffs. These were an area that were just basically sheer cliffs that just went straight from the ground all the way up, really high, really tall. You couldn't really get on most of them, except for over here. But here in the back, they created this really nice wall and a very different feeling to all the other areas. Now, in the vertical cliffs, we had our key focal area, which was this tower. In terms of the gameplay, the player is always being told, oh, we need to make it to the tower. So using the story elements, we're drawing the player to this tower, and that is our main central focus point. Anywhere you're on the map, you can pretty much see this tower. If you're down here in the desert plains, you can see the tower from over here. Even when you're back over here in this backside near the sandy cliffs and the desert plains, you still have a great vantage point here. When you're on the backside of the rolling hills is the only time you occasionally lose sight of it. So you'll still have times where you lose sight of your main focal point, but that's okay. As long as it's not for too long, and the paths leading back to the main central area will highlight it quite nicely. So if you were back here on the rolling hills, when you're coming around this cliff edge, you get this perfect straight shot of our main focal point, which was the tower. So again, just try and think of ways to direct the player towards your main focal point if it's not in view. Now, if you're creating a more linear environment that the player will follow down a straight path, and you're not making this giant hub world that, you know, will spoke out, we're going to look at some techniques that will help you plan your linear sections, and that is to highlight and block. Now, highlighting and blocking is where you highlight your main objective and essentially block the player from getting there. So in the scene here from Madagascar, in an earlier section of the level, which was much more linear, we were trying to highlight the area that the player needs to go to upon entering the scene. They entered from over down here along this trail, and their goal, again, was this tower. We were making this a theme throughout the entire environment of these towers you need to go to, so that throughout the entire progression of the level, you're constantly making your way towards a tower that you're trying to find. You're trying to find the right one. So we're highlighting this tower up here on this large cliff, and behind it is the big volcano from the previous slides. So your goal is to make it to this tower. Now, we highlight it when you enter the space, and then we essentially block it off. You can see here this large rock, you know, bunch of rocks and huge outcropping of rocks. You can't get up there. You're like, well, how am I supposed to get up there? Now, we highlight the objective, we block it off, and then we lead you with your eyes throughout the progression of the environment. This allows you the ability to give the player or the viewer some sense of discovery. They can see where they need to go, but they don't immediately know how to get there. So they need to essentially explore and figure things out for themselves. Now, the best way to do this is highlight with leading lines. As you can see here, this path makes a great leading line to our next focal point, which is the bridge. Right over here, this is what's going to help the player cross to get over here to their main objective. Now, using a man-made object in a natural environment definitely is something that sticks out. But since it is wood and, we're not having crazy garish colors in here, like this bridge isn't painted yellow, we need to highlight to the player where to go, as larger spaces generally can confuse players and help them get lost. Now, the road is a great leading line as it is this harsh bank that leads right back to the bridge. But if your eyes just fall along the straightness of this road at the very beginning, it leads to our secondary objective, which is a waterfall that has a hidden little treasure behind the waterfall. It's just hidden in there, and it's not something all players will find, but it's the next point of creating a linear environment, and that is creating secondary objectives and using creative ways to highlight them. It makes your space feel larger, and it invites players to explore more. And when they explore more, they feel like the world is bigger and that there's more to do and see, and it's a living, breathing place. Now, another great way to highlight those things is with movement. With the waterfall, we have a lot of movement, a lot of running water. You're like, ooh, I want to check that out. It's a waterfall. Those are always cool. So we use that to highlight it, but we also are using our leading line here from this road. We are also using organic and natural elements within the scene to help draw the player's eye towards this bridge. Now, as you can see here, here's our highlighted objective, and what we're doing is we're creating a line with our environment itself that leads directly down to the bridge. It's a subtle and not really noticeable cue to the player that hey, this is a line. No, it's a very subtle line here. You can see that this eroded earth cliff is creating a really nice line. It's just all these focal points are just drawing you to this bridge. We're also doing the same with the river itself. It's a flowing river. It's all flowing this way towards the bridge. It's just creating all these great lines to this focal point bridge, which is where the player needs to go. So we're helping direct the player where we want them to go, where their eyes should follow and lead to, and that's this bridge. We're also doing the same thing even with these tree canopies. They're arranged in such a way that they all were at the exact same height to help emphasize this line towards this bridge. So again, you want to use your environment itself to help lead the player to a specific area that you need them to go to if it's really important. For side objectives, it's a little less important. You can kind of hint to them. It just makes the world feel bigger, but you want your main focal point to be having a lot of leading lines to it. If that's either man-made with, say, the road, or natural with the formation of your rocks cascading down into some terrain that will all lead towards the bridge and your main objective. Again, this can be seen here. Our current objective is this doorway. We know we have to get to this door and get through it to get to the next space. Now, being a door in a very jungly setting, it stands out quite a lot. But not only are we using just man-made assets and leading lines to get there, we're also using color. Now, color is a great way to highlight different routes and different areas of interest. Players can see, oh, there's some orange over here. It's all by the door, and I see a bunch around here. It clearly is leading them to believe, like, this is somewhere I need to go. It stands out from this jungly green environment. And when they come in, when the player enters this space, they can see, oh, well, I can't go forward. Is if you drive a little farther forward in the Jeep, you'd see that this bridge is out. And you're like, well, where do I go? Well, I can see that there's all this orange here in the background near this door that I need to go to. And there's this great clumping of orange and yellow flowers here on the left. And then all the player has to do is turn, and they find a secondary trail that they can then take on to proceed to their environment. Again, we're highlighting our objective. It's being lit by some great frontal lighting, which is another good key you want to use, is using your lighting to highlight your objective. It's a man-made asset in a very natural setting. So again, it sticks out a bunch. We're using nice pops of color around there to highlight the fact that, hey, this is somewhere we want to go. And we're blocking the player from actually just taking a straight beeline to their objective. It allows you to give a sense of this is a great place to explore. So again, you want to highlight your goal, your focal point upon entering the zone, and block them from actually getting to that main objective. As you don't want just to beeline towards it. You want to be able to do some twists, some turns, so it doesn't feel so monotonous and like you're just running down a hallway. You want to highlight side paths to give the impression that the space is larger and give these areas your little character moments, add little bits of story in them that you wouldn't really otherwise be able to do. Now, besides the focal cues I've already mentioned, we're just going to take a quick look at a few more examples to really nail this home. Now, again, here in this scene, this deserty scene from Uncharted 3, you're on a horse, you're riding through this environment, and you're trying to chase this truck. Now, you can't see the truck, you don't really know where to go, but using this great leading line of this really sandy shelf along this cliffside, you can really tell where you need to go. It's drawing the player towards this area of where they're supposed to be heading towards. We're using different colors with the sand on top of these very red rocks. We're using a nice wide with essentially road to help really draw them along. Not only that, but we're also using this V shape here in these large cliffs to really highlight that there's a canyon here. This is somewhere you can pass through. It's an opening. It draws the focus here as there's a nice amount of contrast. Not only the contrast of the sky and the rocks, but we're also getting this contrast here in the shadow as well as this lit side of the rock. So we're using shapes such as the V. We're using contrast in the lighting here, some great shadows, and then some great highlights, as well as the leading lines throughout this area. In this space, we're using man-made objects and the contrast between the fog and the near man-made object here to really highlight that, hey, there's a path over here, as well as just these eroded earths. Again, they really help draw the player along. It's creating a nice little path. We also have a few more man-made assets up here, these little like marker beacon towers. Once you find one, you kind of know that, hey, I can get around them so that when you see one up here, you're like, I can actually get up here. Let me go find a way to get up there and explore a bit more on my own. We're also using this tree branch here that helps lead the eye towards these cliffs that they have the ability to explore, get up on, find some treasure. So we're using this tree here to kind of highlight that you can go this way, and it's all pointing upwards towards this cliff face. As well as we have the lighting, we brought these cliffs out far enough that they would catch this really nice edge light, and that just kind of highlights them and again creates that line that we want to see. They're subtle, organic methods of leading the player's eye so that they know where to go. In this space here, your objective is to catch up with this truck. You're in a Jeep, you're speeding along, you're busting through some fences, you got to catch up with this Jeep. Now, for the gameplay, we needed the player to get onto this little service ramp and eventually rope swing to the truck. Now, that can be really difficult because how are you going to tell the player you have all this freedom to drive all around this space, but we need you to get onto this little ramp? So we did that again by highlighting specific areas with lighting. We lit the bridge itself with a lot of really bright lighting, so it stands out. You can see it extends way back here, a lot further than anything over here. We also used these little dirt banks here to help create this nice walled effect, as well as just these lines that are all pointing directly towards the bridge. These lines over here, again, also point to the bridge. We have this little brick barricade here that really stops the player from going forward, and it really contrasts nicely with the bright blue ocean water. We dropped the areas of building in over here into shadow so that their details didn't become overpowering and would lose the player on where to go. So we're dropping things in a shadow to de-emphasize how important they are and emphasize other areas with lighting. With our focal cues in place, we can help lead the player along to their next current objective. As artists, we want to lead the eye to where they need to go next so that they don't get frustrated and just want to leave our environment. We can do this with pass, negative space, value separation, color, lighting, asset concentration, and movement. All these are great ways to help lead your player through your environment.